Minus 30 seconds. T minus 20 seconds. 10, 9, 8, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, 0.
I don't have to tell you things are bad. Everybody knows things are bad. It's a depression. Everybody's out of work or scared of losing their job. The dollar buys a nickel's worth. Banks are going bust. Shopkeepers keep a gun under the counter. Punks are running wild in the street, and there's nobody anywhere who seems to know what to do, and there's no end to it. We know the air is unfit to breathe, and our food is unfit to eat. We sit watching our TVs while some local newscaster tells us that today we had 15 homicides and 63 violent crimes, as if that's the way it's supposed to be. We know things are bad, worse than bad. They're crazy. It's like everything everywhere is going crazy, so we don't go out anymore. We sit in the house, and slowly the world we're living in is getting smaller, and all we say is, please, at least leave us alone in our living rooms. Let me have my toaster and my TV and my steel-belted radios, and I won't say anything. Just leave us alone. Well, I'm not going to leave you alone. I want you to get mad. I don't want you to protest. I don't want you to riot. I don't want you to write to your congressman because I wouldn't know what to tell you to write. I don't know what to do about the depression and the inflation and the Russians and the crime in the street. All I know is that first, you've got to get mad. You've got to say, I'm a human being. My life has value.
This is a documentary, an oral history of U.S. strategic nuclear policy. Those who played a part tell the story. They summarize the evolution of a 60-year history, from the dawn of nuclear weapons to the 21st century. The speakers address two fundamental questions. First, what has been the purpose of U.S. nuclear weapons? And second, how have the policy, the weapons, and the war plans evolved? Foremost, this is a history of nuclear deterrence. The deterrent role of nuclear weapons has remained constant throughout the evolution of policy, world events, war plans, and nuclear delivery systems. This is not a comprehensive history, but rather a primer to stimulate further thought about strategic nuclear policy and about the broader question of national security strategy. There are significant aspects not covered in this series. The role of the legislative branch, the development of non-strategic nuclear forces, specific weapons technologies, and the role of the nuclear laboratories and the production complex. These are stories for another time. History tells us where we've been, and it can provide us some valuable insight for the future. This oral history is intended to provide a foundation for discussing some very important questions. What truly will be the role of nuclear weapons? What will be the requirements in the future for U.S. nuclear forces, for the stockpile, and for the nuclear weapons complex?
The bombers of the U.S. 8th Air Force invaded Marienburg today. 2 flying fortresses were shot down. Another German factory is missing.
When the U.S. Army 8th Air Force arrived in Britain in 1942, a doctrine of daylight, high-altitude precision bombing developed around the Norden bomb site.
And we thought that we were going to be able to hit military targets and never hit civilian targets. We thought we could hit a pickle barrel from 18,000 feet. The British said you can't do that because you're never that accurate, and if you fly by daylight, you'll lose too many planes to German interceptors. So they bomb by night, aiming at entire cities.
It was an Allied bomber offensive with both the British and the Americans adapting different doctrines and bombing in different ways. It was much shorter distances that the bombers had to fly, and it was against a different set of defenses than you had in the Pacific. Air war in the Pacific was more catch as catch can in the way we had to adapt to it.
Japan was understood as a special case. The Air Force was willing to do area bombing when it couldn't do what they were counting as precision bombing, which also wasn't that precise, but it was a different operational setup, and it was a different way of understanding what they were doing.
The basic question was whether or not you would be able to break industrial structures, aircraft production plants, engine production plants, petroleum refineries, electrical grids, things like that, whether you'd be able to destroy those with your bombing campaign.
In Germany, factories were highly concentrated and often segregated from residential areas, making them targetable by precision bombing. While in Japan, war industries were dispersed rather than concentrated, and they were often intertwined with densely populated residential districts. The Japanese target complex prompted the operational commander, General Curtis LeMay, to change tactics.
When LeMay decided to take the B-29s, which were really very elegant bombers and had lots of equipment, he took a lot of the equipment out so they could fly with more bombs, more incendiary bombs, and sent them over by night in a night attack rather than by daylight, so they wouldn't run into any Japanese interceptors.
LeMay was the most effective combat commander of any service that I met in the 3 years I was in the Air Force. He had one objective, that was to destroy targets, and associated with that, the objective of reducing the number of crew members lost per unit of target destruction.
If you see LeMay in Europe and if you see LeMay in the Pacific, Tommy Power's always there. It is my own belief that Tommy Power was probably more the strategist than LeMay. But I think that those two men worked very well together in terms of getting the most out of their equipment and their men.
And he tried out this approach very similar to the British in Europe of just bombing out all of Tokyo in one attack. Maybe if you burn an entire city, which in the case of Tokyo involved 100,000 people being killed, the Japanese will quit.
The first and the fiercest of these urban area attacks came on March 9, 1945. LeMay had abandoned the doctrine of high-altitude daylight bombing against military assets and reverted to the urban area firebombing strategy practiced by the British against Germany. A half a world away from the carnage, in the high desert of New Mexico, scientists from Los Alamos made preparations to test a new and more lethal device, an atomic bomb. The foundation of strategic nuclear policy would arise from a confluence of this revolutionary new capability and the air war strategy practiced over Japan. In July 1945, the U.S. was facing a costly invasion of the Japanese mainland.
Hospitals were being set up. There was one 20,000-bed hospital on Tinian, where I was stationed alone. We could look across and see 1,600 ships in the harbor at Saipan, preparing for the invasion.
As American planners prepared to maximize direct military pressure upon the Japanese government and the population, President Truman issued his final approval to the Secretary of War for the release of the atomic bomb. The atomic bombings were the culmination of the Great Firebombing of Tokyo, a strategy that copiously provided that military pressure.
It was such a shock to the Japanese to see 80 to 100,000 people killed in Hiroshima and Nagasaki in the most brutal way that they reacted to it more than they did, I think, to the firebombing. Although the extent of the firebombing is not well recognized. And I have never seen an analysis of whether the nuclear could have been avoided if LeMay had been allowed another few weeks to carry on the firebombing, as at one point he, I think, was suggesting.
When I went to Tokyo, it was just absolutely devastated. The damage in Tokyo was a result of thousands of raids, thousands of sorties by thousands of bombers. Whereas in the case of the atomic bomb, there was one airplane and one bomb, and people were totally unprepared for what happened. Whereas the dropping of the second bomb, even though the extent of the damage in Nagasaki was less than Hiroshima, the fact that there was a second bomb and the implication was that there were more, I think that's what finally tipped the scales.
The Japanese didn't surrender in 2 days after Nagasaki because their military capability had been reduced very much. They surrendered because they had the vision that this could happen every week, and they couldn't stand to have all those cities destroyed. And in nuclear deterrence, if civilians get killed, we can call that incidental damage or collateral damage. But many people said that's what really is the basis of deterrence, that the other side can't stand having that many people killed.
Hiroshima and Nagasaki ushered in the need to think differently about war with atomic weapons. Would the U.S. adopt a de facto policy of urban area atomic bombardment? Were the cities of an adversary to be held hostage as a deterrent to aggression? How would the targeting of urban industrial areas be reconciled with the tradition of precision bombing? And as the accuracy of nuclear weapon systems improved, would more precise targeting introduce new concerns about the prospect of nuclear war fighting? These questions, and many others, would inform the evolution of a strategic nuclear policy. Over time, policy would be derived from the influence of successive presidential administrations, dynamic world events, as well as the evolutionary development of nuclear weapons systems.
The mobilization in the conventional weapons field and nuclear field are very parallel. In both cases, civilian needs trumped any military need. The one big difference is we kept secret what was happening in nuclear labs.
Like most Americans in 1945, the scientists and their families at Los Alamos were anxious to put the war behind them. Many returned to universities, leaving behind a scientific enterprise that faced an uncertain future and a new body of knowledge which continued to be shrouded in great secrecy.
There were very few people who actually understood the atomic bombs as they existed in the period right after World War II. The security restrictions were still intense. The development of atomic bombs, nuclear bombs, was still in an early phase.
Everyone understood, kind of outside of their official capacity, that the atomic bomb was a weapon of extraordinary devastation. So they had this tool, this weapon, on the one hand, and the knowledge that they were, the knowledge base that they were building was for much more discriminate force.
On the other hand, there had to be assumptions that would be made that would guide military planning. Would you or wouldn't you use the atomic bomb?
A commander's job is to demonstrate how to prevail in a war, and therefore how to plan for that war. And as such, nuclear weapons, pretty much from the beginning, have been treated as instruments of war.
These weapons were simply looked upon as being essentially larger conventional weapons. I think that Truman in particular had a very personal understanding of the damage that these weapons could do, and I believe that Truman really didn't want to use them.
Private reflections were quite apprehensive about what the implications of this were for the future of humanity. In terms of his public pronouncements, he, of course, associated the bomb with victory in World War II, and also for a brief time period at least, Truman and the Truman administration seemed to seriously explore possibilities of international control.
If they do not now accept our terms, they may expect a rain of ruin from the air, the like of which has never been seen on this earth.
Even as President Truman issued a final ultimatum before the second bomb was dropped on Nagasaki, he promised to redirect atomic power towards the maintenance of world peace. The stage was set for the development of a proposal for the international control of atomic energy by an expert board of consultants that included Robert Oppenheimer, who had led the development of the atomic bomb. In less than a year, Bernard Baruch, a successful Wall Street speculator, was appointed as the U.S. representative to the UN Atomic Energy Commission. There, he presented the American proposal, which came to be known as the Baruch Plan. Almost immediately, the Soviet delegation raised objections to the plan's proposed controls on fissionable materials and an on-site inspection regime that threatened ongoing secret work deep inside Russia.
The Soviet position was that, we're going to expect another world war in, say, 20 years, so we need to start preparing for it now. At the end of the war, the Soviet leaders made a number of speeches setting out their view of how international relations would develop after the war. And Stalin said that Lenin's theory of imperialism was still operative, and that as long as imperialism existed, there would be wars.
When George Kennan, the American chargé in Moscow, reported on Stalin's speech, official Washington first began to regard the Soviets as a threat.
Kennan's long telegram was meant to do several things. One, to alert Americans that Russia was not going to be easy to live with. Secondly, if we wait and hold them, in the long run, communism might lose its expansionist self-confidence. Now, Kennan's containment doctrine said that if you keep the Russians contained, keep them from expanding, they will look at their own article of scientific analysis that says the world is bound to have come under communist control and see that it's wrong.
But throughout 1946, the Soviets consolidated political power in a series of buffer states, forming what Winston Churchill would call an Iron Curtain.
With the onset of the Cold War, symbolized by Churchill's speech, increasingly the emphasis was on maintaining nuclear supremacy, preparing America and the West militarily for this long and desperate struggle.
Churchill's suspicion of Joseph Stalin at the end of World War II had been confirmed, and he cautioned Truman to protect and maintain the American monopoly of the atomic bomb.
The fact that that came more or less simultaneously with the other effort to promote international control, I think shows the ambivalence of that period.
As he contemplated the possibility of an emerging Soviet nuclear capability, Truman was also determined to maintain civilian control of the bomb and appointed David Lilienthal chairman of the newly created Atomic Energy Commission. In April 1947, its first report warned of serious weaknesses in the situation from the standpoint of the national defense and security.
One thing we really don't know today is how much did the Soviets know about how few functional atomic bombs we had in 1946 and 47. And by many measures, we had none. What we had was on the shelf in a state that would take weeks to get it ready for use. These would have been very manpower-intensive nuclear weapons that had to be kept ready. And we weren't doing that because there wasn't the motivation to do it, and we weren't expecting the Cold War, weren't expecting to use weapons against the Soviet Union.
In 1947, the Truman Doctrine, ensuring the independence of Greece and Turkey, drew a line preventing further Soviet expansion in Europe.
The foreign policy of the United States is the creation of conditions in which we and other nations will be able to work out a way of life free from coercion.
You have to remember that the United States was doing something that was revolutionary through World War II and immediately beyond. We were making decisions that we would enter and remain engaged in the world in a way that we had never done before.
And the United States had loaned Europe about $11 billion in various aid programs to kind of kickstart the French, British economies. And in late 46, early 47, economic progress begins to slow. And so there's this growing sense of emergency.
In 1948, the collapse of Czechoslovakia to communist rule shook us up in that Czechoslovakia had been the only democracy in Eastern Europe between the wars, and it seemed like this was the last kind of straw.
But I think it's the Berlin crisis that really begins to give this a kind of military edge. But when Stalin imposed the blockade, I mean, he was resisting what he saw as moves to create a separate West Germany.
The blockade on Berlin shook us up more. It's the second blow within a short period of time in 1948, and it directly involved American forces. It seemed to be an attempt maybe to set dominoes going to affect all of Germany. We mainly bet on a non-military approach. We were using military transports to fly coal and food to West Berlin. But as a backup for that, we also did make a big move of American bombers to Britain.
I think it's fair to say that the contingency planning by 46 and 47 was focused on the fear that you may have a war with the Soviet Union.
We warned the Soviets that if they did some things they could easily do, shoot down our planes or send tanks into Berlin, that we were moving, allegedly, the nuclear forces into Britain.
I think sending the B-29s to Europe was a kind of reminder that the US had the atomic bomb, but Stalin knew that. He didn't need to be reminded. To stop the airlift, he'd have had to escalate the situation. I think that's what he didn't want to do. He to the confrontation.
Just the mere existence of atomic bombs in 1948, I think, helped restrain him.
The American hints at using nuclear weapons in 1948 shows that when you have a monopoly, you can lightly play with nuclear threats and get some results.
With the prospect of conflict on the horizon in Western Europe, it had become clear to the Truman administration that there was now a critical need for some fundamental policy guidance about the use of atomic weapons. The Berlin crisis of 1948 was the first of several critical drivers of U.S. strategic nuclear policy. As they prepared contingency war plans, the Joint Chiefs of Staff sought guidance on the use of atomic weapons.
I don't think there's really any clearly defined U.S. policy toward whether nuclear weapons will be used and how they might be used before the autumn of 1948. And that is what makes NSC 30 and the NSC 20 series so important, they begin to come to grips with some of those issues.
NSC 30 declared that the U.S. was prepared to use atomic weapons in the event of war, and the decision to do so would rest with the President.
The President will decide to use them when he wants to. He'd hate to use them ever again, but if it's necessary, he will.
NSC 30 first established a deterrent role for atomic weapons as a counterbalance to Soviet forces in Eastern Europe. The National Security Council also developed NSC 20/4.
But what we now had is we're settling down into the rhythm of the Cold Wars. We're now settling down into the Soviet Union as the enemy. As we're now settling down into the United States strategy for deterring the Soviet Union, if deterrence fails, having to fight a war with the Soviet Union being based around nuclear weapons, we're settling down into that rhythm where there's a process that guidance flows into the planning system, and that guidance is going to come out of the National Security Council mechanism. Both Hoyt-Vandenberg, who was Chief of Staff of the Air Force, and the Joint Chiefs themselves are beginning to ask the question, if we had to execute the contingency war plans that we have tomorrow, what would happen? Teams were sent out to look at the readiness of Strategic Air Command. They came back with very negative reports.
So Vandenberg looked around. The senior World War II leadership is sort of gone. The Akers, the Spatzes, and LeMay's head and shoulders above everybody else. So he gets the call.
LeMay was a brilliant operator, and I think probably fair to say a brilliant commander. Very dynamic, very energetic, and he wanted a force that could in fact fight a nuclear war.
LeMay was continually concerned about the lack of photographic intelligence. They began the atomic targeting based on maps, and some captured German reconnaissance photographs.
So they took the analytical inputs and they sat down and said, you know, the weapon will go here, it will go here, here's how we're going to get there.
And that you would also employ the same ideas that had been used during World War II for deep interdiction strategic bombing, and that is to take out the enemy's industrial capacity. Now, of course, industrial capacity was also co-located with cities, and so there you would have a tremendous amount of disruption using nuclear weapons on those targets.
LeMay's primary objective was to ensure that SAC would have the capability to deliver a single massive attack, and for this, he would require a force of new long-range bombers.
Harry Truman came to office without a lot of experience, certainly no experience in foreign affairs to speak of. The one thing that he brought to the White House was a very fine-tuned look at how you did budget making. And he insisted that Forrestal stick within very, very tight constraints.
James Forrestal became the nation's first Secretary of Defense in the midst of a brutal budget battle among the newly formed Joint Chiefs. Forrestal tried but failed to resolve the differences. In February 1949, Eisenhower was brought in to mediate the dispute over budget priorities that favored the Air Force's new B-36 atomic bomber.
The Navy saw this as a threat to its ability to project power from aircraft carriers, and they saw the Air Force perhaps as threatening the control of Navy, sea-based aviation.
The Navy is posing some very serious questions about American nuclear strategy and reliance on strategic bombing. And that, to me, is kind of the more important dimension to the Admiral's revolt. Because what they're saying, in a sense, is what some people in the Air Force itself had admitted. General Harmon did an analysis of the strategic bombing campaign and concluded that it'll do serious harm, serious damage to the Soviet Union, but it's not an assured war-winning strategy.
Soon, decisions would be made by Forrestal's successor, Lewis Johnson, ensuring that SAC would get its atomic bombers. In early summer 1949, they represented the only U.S. strategic capability to deter the Soviets. In July, the Senate would ratify the NATO treaty, and now atomic weapons would underpin Article 5 of this new security commitment. One month later, an event, unfolding deep inside the Soviet Union, would seriously challenge this deterrent capability. On September 3, 1949, a specially equipped B-29, flying east of the Kamchatka Peninsula, detected the presence of radioactive residue from the blast of Joe 1, the first Soviet atomic test. Only months before, the AEC had deployed a system for the sampling and analysis of evidence from an above-ground nuclear detonation.
Some of us were not surprised. Some of us thought that they would be right on our heels, so to speak, and clearly they were. There were other people, primarily in the government, that thought that it would take them a much longer time.
There were a couple of important people who said it would take a long time, General Groves and Vannevar Bush. But even Vannevar Bush said it'll take 20 years unless they give it the highest priority, which is exactly what they did.
So we underestimated the speed with which they could move. We failed to understand the degree of assistance in 1948-49 that the Soviets had obtained from spies in the West.
The detection of the test immediately put in train a number of actions by the president. In the next month, for example, he approved a request by the JCS to very largely increase the capability for producing nuclear materials.
The approval of the Special Advisory Committee's recommendations set in motion a series of events. Increased production of fissile material at the plutonium processing facility in Hanford, Washington, accelerated production of the new Mark IV bomb at Los Alamos, and construction of nuclear weapons storage facilities around the country.
And then they increased everything. They not only increased the production of U-235 and plutonium, they began a vigorous exploration of the Colorado Plateau to find more uranium.
I think they were making it up as they went along. We were all making it up as we went along. The executive branch on the one hand, and the legislative on another. There's no question. I mean, it was a very revolutionary time. We were dealing with something that nobody had ever had before.
The Soviet possession of the atomic bomb ended the United States nuclear monopoly. This would profoundly affect defense policy and war planning.
The military strategy depended completely on the capacity for our monopoly of the nuclear weapons to deter and counterbalance the very large conventional forces which the Soviet Union had.
As early as August 1947, the Joint War Plans Committee began drafting a series of contingency war plans that authorized an ever-increasing role for atomic weapons. Half Moon was the first of these plans approved during the Berlin crisis of 1948.
There's a witch's brew of names that you have from those days as you move from Half Moon to Trojan to Off Tackle to what have you, and then all the supporting war plans, et cetera, et cetera. Basically, you have a joint outline war plan and you have supporting plans for it. And the joint outline war plan that the JCS approved will take whatever the strategic concept is and put it into play.
In the absence of detailed higher level guidance, those involved in nuclear war planning carried over what they knew from World War II, including a sense that they were involved in an enterprise of precision targeting. They carried over the same sense of target categories. They carried over the same sense that nuclear weapons were primarily blast weapons.
A nuclear weapon has, in addition, radiation, fire, which are difficult to predict. They're difficult to calculate. The planning of nuclear weapons tends not to include these effects simply because they are so difficult to calculate, but they're there. The earliest weapons, of course, were uranium bombs, fission bombs. These were delivered by high-altitude, long-range bombers. But the accuracies of these early systems were measured in terms of large fractions of a nautical mile, or maybe even a couple of nautical miles. So the suitable targets had to be large area targets.
In late 1949, a new emergency war plan dubbed Off Tackle called for attacks on 104 urban targets with 220 atomic bombs, plus a re-attack reserve of 72 weapons. The prime targeting objective was to disrupt the Soviet will to wage war.
The targeting categories were completely consistent with targeting philosophy and some operations in World War II. The first one was Bravo, which stood for blunting of nuclear forces and nuclear capability. The second one was Delta, which stood for destruction of the urban industrial base. And the third one was Romeo, which stood for retarding an enemy's ability to mobilize.
This was our short-term war plan. And within the next 18 months, there was nothing other than the air offensive, and within the air offensive, specifically the nuclear component of it, which carried any chance of affecting the outcome of the war early on.
What impact would this have on the defense of Western Europe? Would the president be more cautious in the face of Soviet provocation? By the end of 1949, Truman was forced to re-examine national security policy in light of a nuclear-armed adversary.
With the explosion of the first Soviet atomic bomb, the United States felt vulnerable really for the first time. How much is enough for deterrence? Herb York, in his book, says that logically it would have been enough to have fission weapons, and I believe that. But politically, it is not enough, especially when you say the other side, because we can think of a super weapon, they might think of a super weapon and build it.
The primary reason for the development of the super, for ultimately instituting a fairly aggressive program to develop the super, was fear of the Russians.
People who a year or so before had been committed to the idea of international control of atomic weapons now have made a dramatic shift toward the idea of keeping ahead of the Russians.
Knowledge of the super, as the hydrogen or thermonuclear bomb was first known, was closely held in the fall of 1949. Its development was the focus of a vigorous debate among fewer than 100 people in the U.S. government. Senator Brian McMahon, chairman of the powerful Joint Committee on Atomic Energy, and General Omar Bradley, chairman, Joint Chiefs of Staff, were among those who supported building a super bomb and believed that we should get ahead as quickly as possible. Truman also heard from those who opposed its development.
Well, the Atomic Energy Commission itself, that is the 5 atomic energy commissioners, were divided on the subject. The president set up a special subcommittee to study the question.
The Special Committee of the National Security Council consisted of AEC Chairman David Lilienthal, Secretary of Defense Lewis Johnson, and Secretary of State Dean Acheson.
That committee met for 2 months, and at the end of January reported to Truman and essentially recommending that he go forward with the development of the hydrogen weapons. That was something that was very much contested and argued about, debated within the administration, but nevertheless, the committee recommended it, and President Truman, in about 7 minutes, approved it.
He had no doubt in his mind that it has to be done if it works. The idea that something is too good for us to work on just did not make any sense to him. He never said that, but that is my feeling of him.
He also directed his principal advisors on security to produce for him a study as to how U.S. strategy would be affected by this new development. It looked at the larger question of what should we do about our relations and policy toward the Soviet Union.
Delivered to the president on April 5, 1950, NSC 68 was a seminal policy document on U.S. national security. Written largely by Paul Nitze, NSC 68 reaffirmed the character of the Soviet threat contained in the earlier NSC 20/4, but now the threat was seen as imminent.
In 1954, it was called a year of maximum danger. It assumed that they would have about 200 weapons, and that this would be quite sufficient to do tremendous harm to the United States.
Which, in my view, was greatly exaggerated, because various of Nitze's estimates then, before that, and after that, about where the Russians were and where they were going to be, were all of them greatly exaggerated.
Paul Nitze was a very skilled infighting bureaucrat in the way that he conducted NSC 68. He talks about it freely in several of his books. NSC 68 was delivered, Dean Acheson, as Secretary of State, basically with Nitze had made the fundamental decision that they didn't want to lay the budget figures out in front of Truman. So NSC 68 was kind of the start of a debate when it gets delivered to the White House in the spring of 1950.
But Truman wasn't about to take Nitze's or Acheson's word for it, and set about evaluating the implications as well as the probable cost for the massive nuclear and conventional buildup called for in NSC 68. Within 2 months, however, this careful and deliberative effort would be cut short by a new military imperative.
By the middle of 1950, the North Koreans had a fully trained and equipped army. The Russians had seen to that. The day came when it was revealed what had all along been the communist plan: the invasion and seizure of South Korea. The invasion got underway on the morning of Sunday, June 25th, 1950.
The invasion of South Korea was a surprise like the Berlin blockade of 1948 and the Soviet atomic test of 1949. Individually, these events prompted the evolution of U.S. strategic nuclear policy. Taken together, they sparked a massive buildup of the nation's nuclear and conventional forces.
Many people attach that buildup to NSC 68. I myself have never been sure that there was quite that close a connection. We had a war on our hands. We had tremendous concern and sense of danger in Europe.
The Korean War hit, and the nature of the decision-making process becomes different almost overnight. And NSC 68, it's one of those peculiarities of history that it happened to be available at the time it did.
But it was really the shock of the Korean attack which led Truman immediately to take the lid off of the defense budget.
In the United States, there had been great shock that first that war had come about, and there was shock in Europe as well, because it looked as though the Soviets might be on the march. That's when the European countries decided to ask the United States to send Eisenhower to be the commander.
You have the wholehearted backing of the people of the United States, and I know that you'll have that same backing from the 11 other nations who are in the Atlantic Treaty. Goodbye and good luck.
In the fall of 1950, intelligence assessments delivered to Truman suggested that a window of vulnerability had now opened. Would the U.S. become more vulnerable while it was increasingly drawn into the Korean conflict and before rearmament could restore the strategic balance? The prospect of a Soviet invasion of Western Europe now deeply concerned Truman and Eisenhower.
By winter, the UN forces faced once again the possibility of being driven from Korea. Discouraged, outnumbered, ill-equipped to handle the cold, they barely hung on through the freezing Korean winter.
After we had poured basically all the ready forces we had available into the Korean conflict, It was anybody's call as to where Korea was going to go at that point, whether we'd lose the war, whether the Soviet Union would intervene, things of that sort. It was a very desperate situation.
There was a good deal of talk about trying to estimate what was called the date of maximum danger. Many proposals were in the air that if this is going to happen, it should be headed off.
After the Soviets tested in 1949, it was understandable that the United States began to contemplate whether it would be appropriate and indeed necessary for national security to attack Soviet nuclear targets. But Harry Truman rejected the notion that the United States would deliberately precipitate a war against the communist adversary. At the same time, there are a number of military officers who rejected Truman's view.
And so people like LeMay and others in the early 50s, when we were way ahead of the Russians in the development of bombs and in the accumulation of them, took the view that war is inevitable. And the longer we wait before it comes, the worse off we're going to be.
Now, Stuart Symington, who was the chairman of the National Security Resources Board, had previously been the first Secretary of the Air Force, delivered a report to the National Security Council. Recommended policies and actions in light of the grave world situation. In the fall of 50 or 51, the calls for preventive war, the serious calls that would be considered at the National Security Council, was NSC 100, in my estimation. Any further Soviet aggression in areas to be spelled out would result in the atomic bombardment of Soviet Russia itself. Declaratory policy, atomic bombardment automatic. The closest you get to a call for preventive war is this document, in my estimation. And the National Security Council discussion makes it clear that even the principal author of the document, or the principal sponsor of the document, himself was not calling for preventive war. Now, it's a very different question as we get into the Eisenhower years of how you best use the nuclear stockpile of the United States as a psychological tool.
As nuclear weapons became more firmly rooted in United States defense policy, their growth in yield would become central to the psychology of deterrence.
The natural power of the universe is harnessed in the new atomic bomb. Its tremendous possibilities are explained in this chart.
In just a few years after 1949, we had weapons, pure fission weapons, of 50 kilotons instead of 10 to 20 kilotons. They were very fine nuclear weapons, and we didn't have to have a hydrogen bomb, a super, and besides, we didn't know how to make it. Other people felt that we had to have enormously superior power in order to destroy the Soviet Union.
The policy, as I understood it, was a clear understanding that the purpose was one of deterrence, that we should be ready with something more powerful. Some nuclear weapons made deterrence much stronger.
The development of the hydrogen bomb at Los Alamos was part of a much bigger effort to expand our entire nuclear weapons program, including the production of materials, the mining of uranium, etc.
In 1950, there were 8 sites and 55,000 employees. There were 20 sites 3 years later and 142,000. And this very dramatic growth continued in the 1950s and the 1960s.
Immediately following the detection of the first Soviet atomic test, President Truman authorized successive expansions of the nuclear weapons complex that included plans for a second laboratory in Livermore, California. Meanwhile, at Los Alamos, Edward Teller and his colleagues fervently sought a practical design for the hydrogen bomb based upon a fusion reaction within liquid deuterium.
There were contributions from a number of people, but the driving force was Teller. I mean, he was relentless and took it up with everyone he could interact with.
Stan Ulam came in to see him at Los Alamos. Stan Ulam, mathematician who'd been at Los Alamos for quite a while, and said, you know, Edward, if we compress this liquid deuterium, we can make it work. The reaction rate will be bigger and all that.
The idea was that you put a nuclear weapon inside of a container, and for a few moments, the container will contain not only the bomb, but the energy it produces, and that energy can be used for other things, such as perhaps compressing a secondary.
Teller said, well, it won't work, but if you were going to do it, you should use the radiation, because all of the energy comes off in radiation, thermal radiation, and that goes faster, it can be tailored more simply.
At that time, I presented a new design in which I had full confidence. We needed the powerful concentrated energy of a primary to make the compression. Once we made it, the secondary worked much better. And that was the whole secret.
Now, Teller asked me to devise an experiment to demonstrate that this concept would work. By July 25th, 1951, I had a big sketch of what turned out to be Mike.
There were no new ideas, but a very competent write-up as to the actual proposal and how it should manifest itself and be proved in a test.
Minus 10 seconds. 9, 8, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1.
Mike was tested in November of 1952, just a few months after Livermore was established. So Livermore, of course, had nothing to do with it, although the press often gave us the credit, and we were not allowed to deny it for reasons of secrecy. So the weaponization took place entirely at Los Alamos. The development of an emergency capability based directly on the deliverable version of Mike.
Its success seems so assured that it is considered a proof test of one of the emergency capability weapons.
Emergency capability weapons were sometimes produced by the Atomic Energy Commission before the concept was tested. It was so urgent they felt to have these capabilities that if a test was successful, then they would have had the weapons in the stockpile capable of delivering.
After Mike, we had the Dirks operation where we went through the development of the jughead, the runts, the shrimp. When runt worked so well, then that was our first so-called deliverable 20-ton thermonuclear device. When thermonuclear weapons were first developed, what it did was gave you more megatons for the buck, so to speak.
Before and in the early stages of the thermonuclear weapon, attention was focused on the very large yields, energy releases available. In fact, the impact of the thermonuclear weapon was not that of enormous yield. It was to make it possible to have vastly more weapons with a limited stock of uranium-235 or plutonium-239.
In 1950, there were approximately 300 weapons in the stockpile. A decade later, there was 22,000.
There was a decision to build more coming from Truman. There was a decision to build power. There was the invention of more powerful versions coming out of Mike and the things related to Mike.
The large growth that we saw in the 1950s and 60s was primarily driven by the capacity of the complex and not truly by requirements.
It was our policy at that time not to wait for requirements from the military, but to find out from the technologies then available what the art of the possible would be.
Technology offers opportunities, offers possibilities. We didn't understand what the objectives ought to be. We didn't know what kind of policies or even what plans and programs ought to be laid to achieve those objectives.
We face the threat not with dread and confusion, but with confidence and conviction. We hold it to be the first task of statesmanship to develop the strength that will deter the forces of aggression and promote the conditions of peace. My citizens, I thank you.
Dwight Eisenhower assumed the presidency in the months following the detonation of the world's first thermonuclear device at Eniwetok. Throughout the campaign, Eisenhower had promised to re-examine the balance between security and solvency. But the initial concern of the new president and his advisors would be resolving the matter of Korea.
Shortly after Eisenhower took office and had started the process of developing a fabric of security policies and plans, in the Soviet Union, Generalissimo Stalin died.
When he dies, there's an almost immediate change of policy in Moscow, which is discussed with the North Koreans, which says we'll now take a series of steps to try to bring the war to an end.
Both sides agreed to a ceasefire in July 1953. By driving the North Korean forces back out of South Korea, the U.S. had produced the status quo ante, and an uneasy truce prevailed. Eisenhower and his Secretary of State John Foster Dulles vowed there would be no more Koreas.
Both he and Dulles were people who thought you must have a coherent strategy. They decided that they would put a major study of alternative policies toward the Soviet Union for the purpose of hearing a really thought through alternative possibilities.
They decided on that in the solarium of the White House mansion, so it took the name solarium as a result of that.
And there were really three approaches that were essentially put forward, each assigned to one team. Task Force A was supposed to consider prospects of a containment policy. B was called drawing the line, that if they took any measures to expand, they would run the risk of a massive response. And C was given essentially the assignment of defending a policy of rollback, the idea of trying to force the Soviet Union to capitulate by coercion.
At the end of our work, which went on for 5 weeks, in complete secrecy here in Washington, we met in the library of the White House.
And each of the teams had a time for a full presentation of its case.
At the end of it, Eisenhower jumped up and said, "Now I'd like to summarize and comment on what we've heard." And he spoke for 45 minutes without a note, pulling the whole thing together. In doing so, he showed his intellectual ascendancy over every man in the room.
Most of the qualities which the press later on simply disregarded.
In the end, Eisenhower reaffirmed a policy of containment. The president was under no illusions of what a nuclear war with the Soviets would be. It would be a war of utter devastation.
The Joe 4 explosion in August of 1953 had a major psychological impact on us. The details were secret. So all the American public and most of the members of the Congress and other American leaders knew was the Russians had exploded a hydrogen bomb.
At the National Security Council, the detonation of a Soviet thermonuclear bomb underscored the urgency of preparing a new national security policy.
All of this flows together in the fall of 1953 into a set of decisions which lead to NSC 162/2. He wanted to pay as much attention as possible to how you could take the psychology of nuclear weapons and turn them into making the strategy as deterrent and possible. And also was his reading, I think, of the Soviets as a fairly conservative group of decision makers. He didn't think they wanted war either.
NSC 162/2 emphasized a nuclear response. In the event of hostilities, the United States will consider nuclear weapons to be as available for use as other munitions, a statement, the true intent of which would be debated for decades.
The defense strategy had two purposes. One was to deter the Soviet Union. The other was to reassure the NATO allies. And therefore, they required really a higher degree of certainty in order to be reassured than the Soviets did to be deterred.
In February 1952, the NATO defense ministers met in Lisbon and agreed to commit 96 divisions in a forward defense of Western Europe.
Well, within a year after making that commitment at Lisbon, it became clear that NATO had neither the resources nor the political will to field a force of that size.
Eisenhower would use increasing numbers of both strategic and tactical nuclear weapons to deter the Soviets in Western Europe. In November 1953, he directed Admiral Radford, Chairman, Joint Chiefs of Staff, to implement the New Look, a military strategy that placed heavy reliance upon nuclear weapons for the long haul.
Eisenhower decided that we were spending too much on the Department of Defense and cut back the planned level of expenditures. This was the new look. We, in the judgment of the administration, could not stand up against the hordes of Soviet soldiers that would be sent against the West, and therefore nuclear weapons were a substitute for maintaining massive conventional forces.
Nuclear weapons got at the heart of NATO strategy very quickly from their initial deployment in 1953. Although the exact role, exactly how and when they were going to be used, was often confusing and ambiguous.
NATO intelligence tended to exaggerate the Soviet threat over the years. The prevailing presumption was a worst possible case, to wit, that the Soviet Union would be bending every resource to build up their military forces against the West as rapidly as possible.
And so a lot of our training and plans were geared on that premise. MC-14/2, massive retaliation, or the tripwire strategy, was basically that should this massive invasion occur, massive nuclear forces would be used. It would be all-out nuclear war. It was all or nothing.
In the notes of a meeting prepared by Colonel Goodpaster, the president's close personal aide, Eisenhower laid out a deterrent nuclear posture that would set in motion a 20-year buildup of nuclear weapons deployed in Western Europe. Goodpaster wrote, he indicated his firm intention to launch a strategic air force immediately in case of alert of actual attack. He stressed that a major war will be an atomic war.
My reading was that if actual attack were made on our forces in Europe or in the United States, the likelihood of escalation to nuclear war was very, very high. And the Soviets knew that.
The root word is terre, which means to frighten with an overwhelming fear. And if you put the prefix DE in front of it, you get to frighten from carrying out acts. It involves emotions as well, of self-preservation, preservation of regimes, preservations of countries.
Deterrence really rests on a strategy of war prevention, not a strategy of war fighting.
The main purpose of the nuclear deterrent is to put an exclamation point on the end of the sentence that says, if you do bad things to us, we will do even worse things to you. So you'd better not do it in the first place. I think where the nuclear weapon made its biggest difference in history was in Europe during the Cold War.
NSC 162/2 had formalized the concept of nuclear deterrence and extended that deterrent to Western Europe. Eisenhower's challenge was to communicate this policy to the Soviets, the NATO allies, and to the American public. Secretary of State Dulles delivered an address to the Council on Foreign Relations in January 1954, publicly announcing the administration's new national security policy that would depend primarily upon a great capacity to retaliate instantly by means and at places of our choosing.
Massive retaliation, the way Dulles and Eisenhower used it, in a way was a suicide pact. It said, if the Russians invade Western Europe, we're going to hit back with everything we have. We're not going to waste a lot of resources on trying to build tank defenses against tanks.
And there's been no other time, I think, the U.S. has ever believed that to an overwhelming conventional capability, its only response was to escalate to the use of nuclear.
The resulting controversy took Dulles and the president by surprise.
People were very skeptical about Dulles's announcement, about basically the credibility of the announcement, that it was just not believable that, if there was going to be some incursion in what was then called French Indochina with communist forces, would the United States would it really be plausible that the United States would use nuclear weapons on its bombers and destroy Moscow? It just seemed such a disproportionate response.
The introduction of nuclear weapons to deal with every possible contingency certainly struck me, and I think a lot of other people, as just being horrendous.
There were several reasons for the criticism, but the most important was that unless the Soviets or the Warsaw Pact launched a massive attack, it did not seem to justify a massive response on our part.
In 1954, William Kaufmann was among an emerging group of civilian strategists who argued that the credibility of retaliation was the key element of deterrence.
There was certainly a problem in the NATO community about the probability that the United States would really let loose its nuclear capabilities in the event of a Soviet invasion.
If the U.S. was there, present in case of any attack, it was bound to be involved because its forces were involved.
But it was not a one-sided affair where we could just blow away some targets, which were never specified, and that there'd be no retaliation.
A massive retaliation was not seen by Eisenhower as the panacea for all forms of military conflict. On the contrary, it was addressed primarily to the question of how to prevent or conduct general war if that should be forced upon you.
Eisenhower never really, I think, came seriously close to considering use of nuclear weapons. So he was much more cautious. We had advantages, technology, air power, nuclear weapons, and they were trying to play to our strength. And I think it was fine with him to have in Dulles a pure ideologue, someone who was going to try to scare the hell out of people. That's declaratory policy. Whether it matches employment policy, what you'd actually do is another matter.
Eisenhower, by betting on massive retaliation, made European economic growth continue longer. Fewer young men had to be in the military. We're all richer today because we took that chance in the 1950s of betting on massive retaliation.
In the early 1950s, much of our deterrent force was based forward. The B-47s, which were based in Morocco, some of them were based in Saudi Arabia, and those were felt to be quite vulnerable.
This was a time when, not long after the Soviet Union had exploded its first nuclear weapon. And the question inevitably came up, well, suppose the Soviet Union were to drop a bomb on these bases, on each of these bases, what would happen?
This question was pondered by researchers at the RAND Corporation. Populated by a unique cadre of top U.S. scientific talent, RAND was perhaps the first defense think tank.
It was a project with a very broad charter, very broad scope, to look at challenges for aeronautics, space, warfare from an Air Force perspective. There was a lot of talented people, some of whom were working on topics that were very relevant to questions of nuclear weapons and nuclear strategy.
One of those people was Albert Wohlstetter, who, in 1954, issued a top-secret report warning that SAC's overseas bases were vulnerable to a Soviet first strike.
Albert Wohlstetter led a team at the RAND Corporation that looked closely at worst-case possibilities of could the Soviets catch all of our bombers on the ground and win World War III. And he sort of convinced people that this was a real risk unless major reforms were made in the way SAC, Strategic Air Command, was based and stationed.
Eisenhower's conception was that you might knock out some bases, but you would not knock out enough of the capability altogether so that they were not faced with retaliation.
But the message was always that if one of their bombers gets in and gets over our base, it could destroy the whole base of 50 or 100 bombers, and if they did that enough times, they'd win World War III, and if we do that to them, we win World War III. And that's very nerve-wracking.
Air Force people remembering the destruction in the Philippines and at Pearl Harbor always felt that if it was important to get in the first blow, if one was coming to war, don't let the enemy get in the first blow.
There's a very deep military logic that would argue for preemption. It's better to get the enemy's forces before they are launched or get you. That's one aspect of preemption. Another is that if your forces are not survivable, there's also a pressure to preempt.
Curtis LeMay once called it anticipatory retaliation. The notion is that war is imminent, it's unavoidable, and you are simply getting the first blow in to be able to destroy an enemy's forces while they're being armed, while they're being fueled.
LeMay was prompted to propose preemption for the same reasons a number of other thinkers were. And that was the realization, correctly, that the only way to limit damage on the United States in a thermonuclear war is to go first.
The most unstable situation is a situation where either side can win, depending on who strikes first, and where neither side might want a war, but each side says, I'd rather have the war I start than the war they start.
The Soviet Union, having their forces vulnerable, faced a similar dilemma. They would feel in a major crisis that if they waited for a full American attack, they might not be able to retaliate.
Bomber crews racing out to take off was very exciting to watch. Makes great cinema. Very bad for the world political stability. And that makes everybody tense, makes everybody in the mood to strike first when in doubt, and is what we typically would call very low crisis stability or strategic stability.
Soon, RAND would issue a new staff report, anticipating a Soviet first strike with thermonuclear weapons against the SAC bomber force based in the U.S. One proposed solution was to develop the capacity to retaliate after absorbing a full nuclear attack by the Soviets.
The concept of the Second Strike Force was indeed developed at RAND, but it was something that was inherent in the administration once the vulnerabilities of our force became clear.
In April 1954, Eisenhower asked James Killian of MIT to direct a study of how science and technology could address the nation's vulnerabilities.
The Killian report was very important, particularly for the matter of assuring the survivability and the effectiveness of the nuclear deterrent. First, we must develop missiles as rapidly as possible. The ICBM would be much less vulnerable than it was an airfield and a bomber.
a hypothetical Soviet strike at our bases led to an acceleration of the development of our missile programs, both the Minuteman and the Polaris program.
And then came the development to put weapons at sea in the black oceans where they could not be found and attacked.
The Air Force's dominance of strategic delivery had sidelined the Navy in the late 1940s, but had not left it idle.
A new naval era dawns with the launching of the Nautilus, one of the largest submarines ever built.
The world's first nuclear-powered submarine was launched in January 1954. The Nautilus was significant not only for its naval engineering, but also for the relentless efforts of Admiral Hyman Rickover to establish a nuclear navy. The capability to remain submerged for weeks and months at a time was essential to creating a survivable second strike platform for nuclear weapons. Now the challenge was to launch a missile.
The Navy Polaris program started out with the idea of mounting liquid-fueled missiles of a very large size on the outside of submarine, which is, of course, kind of an abomination to sailors.
This was sort of a shotgun wedding between the Navy and the Army. The Army had the missile, the IRBM Jupiter, and the Navy was given the job of taking that missile, adapting it, and taking it to sea.
At both laboratories, work proceeded on the development of lighter and smaller thermonuclear warheads, specifically with missile delivery in mind. And Livermore decided to see what was the smallest two-stage weapon we felt we could design there in the early 50s.
After a couple of false starts, we at Livermore began to work on ways to reduce the weight of thermonuclear weapons to the point where they could go into modest-sized missiles.
We came up with an idea which I then presented to the Atomic Energy Commission. We can get a megaton in 600 pounds. Now that was an exaggeration, but we were serious about it.
And that's a huge change. And since the payload weight pretty much drives at the size of a missile that's going to carry it, that offered the prospects that we could have a small missile, hopefully solid propelled, that could fit into a submarine hull.
The Polaris submarine was developed in 1960, ahead of schedule. That doesn't happen too often in the development of military weapons. And I've often said Admiral Rayburn deserves the Nobel Peace Prize for getting it out there when he did, because it took an awful lot of attention, an awful lot of the anxiety out of the nuclear confrontation.
With Polaris, the president was free to make a deliberate decision. If in the event of an assault, he could wait and make certain that exactly what was needed and when.
A ballistic missile submarine changed strategic policy because it became, in the early days, the embodiment of the notion of counter value rather than counter force.
And definitely those missiles were counter-value missiles. Somebody once asked Admiral Rayburn whether a missile fired from the ocean would be accurate enough. And his answer was, if it even hits dry land, it's accurate enough. And what he really meant was, I'm not aiming at a military target, I'm not pretending to be accurate, I'm just imposing damage on the other side, and they know that in advance, and then the war will never happen in the first place.
If you are going to shoot in retaliation at cities, you place a great premium on getting some kind of communication through, but basically you need a very simple message: shoot, don't shoot. And you don't much care how long it takes to get there because you're going to survive.
Key to the viability of Polaris as a deterrent force were improvements in command, control, and communications. Developments in very low-frequency radio technology would provide secure and constant at-sea communication. By 1960, it was clear that Polaris would represent a robust and survivable second strike retaliatory force.
The advent of the strategic submarine certainly brought a new dimension to survivability and clearly has enabled us to have a significant portion of our strategic submarine force at sea in a relatively relaxed posture, but in a survivable posture. And that survivability really enables you to essentially always be able to strike second. And that's really what deterrence is about. It's that responsive capability, not to strike first, but to be able to always strike second.
Arcane debates about strategic vulnerabilities, preserving crisis stability, and survivable nuclear weapons systems like Polaris remained top secret and well out of public view in 1955.
It's Operation Alert 1955.
What stirred the public's imagination was the fear of thermonuclear attack by Soviet bombers.
The intelligence community had the hypothesis that they would build as rapidly as possible. And it was this presupposition of maximum potential output that led to notions about the Balma Gap.
Returning from the Moscow Air Show in July 1955, Air Force Chief of Staff General Nathan Twining reported seeing scores of new Soviet Bison intercontinental bombers. By 1956, Air Force intelligence, using the presupposition of maximum potential output, predicted that within 5 years, the Soviets could have as many as 800 bombers.
Whole cities could be destroyed by bombs delivered by airplanes. What do? Well, you try to make an air defense. You look to the production of more nuclear weapons, improved nuclear weapons.
I think what's notable is that it was a natural inclination at that time to defend the entire country.
One of the earliest defenses to protect U.S. cities was Nike Ajax, a surface-to-air guided missile system equipped with a conventional high-explosive warhead. By 1958, the Nike Hercules system married a more accurate missile with a nuclear warhead.
We had Nike locations all around the country, very extensive defense systems against aircraft. And so everybody, as a natural instinct, was in favor of defending themselves. When the civil defense program started, that was a natural inclination as well.
The emphasis was essentially on individual citizen action, individual preparation. Civil defense is a component of the doctrine of massive retaliation. On the one hand, we're signaling to the Russians, if you attack us, we will be prepared. We are taking steps to prepare and defend our people. On the other hand, if you attack us, you will experience utter destruction. We will respond massively.
With the White House in the background, Washington is one of scores of cities in the nation's greatest air raid drill.
Throughout the mid-1950s, the nation, together with the president and top government officials, participated in Operation Alert. This nationwide civil defense drill included a top-secret command center in White Sulphur Springs, West Virginia.
And there were broadcast facilities there where the president could address the people. And so the idea was continuity of government in the event of the destruction of Washington.
We are here to determine whether or not the government is prepared in time of emergency to continue the functions of government. So there shall be no interruption in the business that must be carried on.
But even as Eisenhower practiced with the nation, he understood that civil defenses and anti-aircraft defenses were no match in a war with thermonuclear weapons. The Atomic Energy Commission began testing deliverable multi-megaton thermonuclear weapons in February 1954. The Bravo test series served to galvanize public attention.
The yield was almost 3 times the most probable value. Unfortunately, the effects of shrimp were felt beyond our proving ground.
The fallout was to the east and relatively heavy for several hundred miles.
The radioactive fallout from those tests was much greater than the scientists had anticipated. With the Bravo test, the issue of radioactive fallout really gripped the public mind.
Eisenhower gave deep thought to the thermonuclear weapon. He began to see it as something going beyond anything that had been experienced in traditional warfare.
I think in the period from the mid-50s through the early 60s, you see a process of gradually increasing public apprehension and awareness.
Eisenhower had a grand conundrum that he was working. How do you talk about national security? And in particular, how do you talk about nuclear weapons issues with the American public? Where on the one hand, you're not scaring them to death and saying that everything is so desperate that it's impossible. But on the other hand, you're not sugarcoating it or just not talking about it.
The great chore you have here is to give people the facts, show them what they can do, get the federal leadership, get the participation of the states and the municipalities without terrifying people, right?
Through his administration, I think he tried to find that right balance.
We had three main instruments for our security: diplomacy, deterrence, and actual defense, actual military operations.
Eisenhower grappled with conflicting intelligence estimates about a bomber gap, a public aroused to the dangers of thermonuclear weapons, and a defense community urging him to spend billions more. His promise of security with solvency led to a reliance upon nuclear weapons for national security. But at the UN, Eisenhower also initiated a diplomatic track to address widespread fears of thermonuclear war.
The United States pledges before you, and therefore before the world, its determination to help solve the fearful atomic dilemma.
The Atoms for Peace speech was a step toward attempting to control nuclear technology in a way that it could be used peacefully. I think it was a very good speech and an important initiative, but had little to do with arms control. The Eisenhower administration did not really come to grips with arms control as a policy and a concept until the moratorium, the 1958 nuclear test moratorium. And that was just the beginning, but that was, as I see it anyway, the beginning.
As he worked to assuage public fears about thermonuclear warfare with a new generation of weapons and delivery systems, Eisenhower was about to receive a most unwelcome surprise.
Great observatories, radar devices, telescopes, binoculars, and the naked eye scan the skies. In Russian, the word for satellite is Sputnik, and Sputnik has the voluntary moon watchers working overtime.
The launch of Sputnik atop a Soviet SS-6 ICBM set in motion a series of political and technological forces that would challenge Eisenhower's policy of massive retaliation.
The importance of this feat cannot be underestimated. It brings mankind closer and closer to an actual escape into space. But it will be some time before either we or the Soviet forces will have long-range missile capacity equal to even a small fraction of the total destructive power of our present bomber force.
President Eisenhower went on television and he explained that this was a tremendous accomplishment of the Soviet system. It showed that they could launch missiles, of course, but it didn't change our basic deterrence.
Eisenhower continued to think that the nuclear confrontation was governing. The damage that would come from that was so apparent and so great that the Soviets were not likely to initiate such a conflict.
Not for 1 minute did Khrushchev want a nuclear war. I think he was perfectly clear that this would be, just devastating. That's what his own scientists were telling him. And I think he thought that Eisenhower believed exactly the same thing. What he thought was going on was a war of nerves.
On the heels of Sputnik came a new report to the president warning of a precipitous Soviet technological advantage, an ICBM capability that could threaten a first strike as early as 1959.
People who had dire views of national security said, of course, the Soviets are ahead. They did a better job with the German engineers. They have more missiles than we. There is a missile gap.
But he said, they haven't told me a thing I haven't been staying awake nights thinking about for these many years.
2 years earlier, the Killian Report had recommended the acceleration of United States missile programs. It also made another equally important proposal, the improvement of U.S. intelligence gathering. This spurred the development of a high-altitude spy plane to monitor Soviet missile deployment.
The U-2 enabled Eisenhower to check areas where they might be producing these weapons and to assure himself that, in fact, they were not in a position yet to manufacture them.
Yet even with the benefit of new intelligence, an improved early warning system, and the promise of survivable retaliatory systems on the horizon, many felt that Eisenhower's policy of massive retaliation was losing credibility.
The rapid development of the H-bomb caused a number of American strategists, particularly at RAND, to recognize that this was going to be a two-sided game. Ultimately,
it was very uncertain, but you could certainly try to limit those kinds of operations by dealing only with targets that were military targets.
The counterforce arose because the counterforce arose in Russia, so you wanted to try to do something about that. So it became natural to try to target the emerging Soviet nuclear capability.
Nobody could guarantee that if you did counterforce and not counter-city, that it would work out, but it was worth a chance.
There is a dividing line of people in the nuclear age, because some believe that nuclear weapons don't fit this, that nuclear weapons only will produce such massive, horrific destruction that no political objective could be achieved by actually using nuclear weapons. Others believe that they could be if they were used in a calibrated fashion, if they were low yield, if they were proportionate to the aggression.
Eisenhower continued to embrace a policy of deterrence by threatening to inflict unacceptable damage upon the Soviets. A new strategic concept proposed to the president at the National Security Council argued for greater flexibility. But Eisenhower regarded the strategy of graduated retaliation coercion as something akin to fighting with nuclear weapons.
But Eisenhower would have none of it. He was adamantly opposed to the idea of incremental engagement.
Certainly, I think that as an experienced commander from World War II, Eisenhower had little truck with that. The fog of war would just wipe away the nature of the signals you were sending.
All of us know that, whether started deliberately or accidentally, global war will leave civilization in a shambles. This is as true of the Soviet system as of all others. In a nuclear war, there can be no victors, only losers.
Eisenhower was a very complicated man with complicated thoughts, and his view was that if we had a boldly stated position, that was part of deterrence in and of itself.
For Eisenhower, the Fleet Ballistic Missile Submarine embodied the very notion of nuclear deterrence, a survivable weapons system that ensured strategic stability. But the deployment of Polaris would create serious new operational challenges. Beginning in the late 1950s, a technological momentum drove the development of U.S. ballistic missile systems. The speed of this growth would overtake national policy and operational planning.
Minuteman I flew on the 63rd of December, 1961. Sam Phillips was a young brigadier general. His bosses had told him, you have to fly this thing in 1961. We were all down at the Cape, and this missile wasn't ready to be flown in 1961. So I said to Sam, look, we'll take this calendar, we'll put it in the blockhouse. We'll extend December till we get the thing flown. So we actually flew it on the 63rd of December. That was Flight Test Missile 401. With that piece of data, we knew the thing would work.
A year before the successful test of Minuteman I, the Navy commissioned Polaris and developed separate targeting plans for their A-1 ballistic missile. A submarine-launched ballistic missile would now greatly complicate the nuclear planning process.
In the late 1950s, you had different commanders, a specified commander, SIGSAC, various unified commanders, EUCOM, PACOM, and so forth, each of them developing their nuclear weapons plans independent of one another.
The theater commanders were identifying targets that the strategic commander also believed needed to be struck, so that you had more than one weapon being applied to a target when perhaps only one or two weapons was necessary.
There was recognition among planners that the interface between deliveries, that the fratricide was likely to ensue.
We'd be killing our own forces, not just enemy forces. And yet the Air Force and the Navy did not have a capability to disengage their different war plans.
Eisenhower referred to the lack of integration as a monstrosity.
In 1958, General Nathan Twining, Chairman, Joint Chiefs of Staff, had proposed improving the nuclear planning process with a joint unified command. Admiral Arleigh Burke, Chief of Naval Operations, vigorously opposed the idea and feared losing control of the Navy's Polaris.
General Twining was certainly well aware that to have an effective integrated plan, that he was going to have to make the Navy comfortable with this process. Twining earlier had pushed for some kind of a structured, coherent planning process.
The compromise, if you will, was that each of the forces would control their own delivery systems, but that targeting had to be combined in a joint staff.
On August 11, 1960, Eisenhower formally approved the proposal for the formation of the Joint Strategic Target Planning Staff, the JSTPS, envisioned by General Twining.
The decision was taken late in the Eisenhower administration to create this new body out in Omaha, Joint Strategic Target Planning Staff. The first thing that the Joint Strategic Target Planning Staff was going to do was put together a single integrated operational plan.
Single integrated operational plan identifies targets, it allocates weapons to the targets, and it decides on how those weapons are delivered to those targets. The PSYOP is based upon the written guidance that begins with the President and is refined by the Secretary of Defense and then further elaborated upon by the Joint Staff.
This is an extraordinarily elaborate undertaking, and PSYOP 62 was the first attempt to do that in a very compressed time frame. It was an inflexible plan in the sense that it didn't have a lot of options built into it.
PSYOP 62 appeared to have a number of options. I believe it was 14, but there was no difference. All it was how generated the forces were. So as more forces became generated, you had what looked like a different option.
Each option included all countries in the Sino-Soviet bloc, giving the president virtually no capability to differentiate. Eisenhower himself began to doubt the wisdom of having only large-scale nuclear attack options.
Eisenhower's science advisor went out and took a look at PSYOP 62 when it was being put together and came back and said it's too inflexible. And I think Eisenhower would have agreed in that.
I think it's fair to say that when Kennedy came into office, he and many of his senior civilian advisors were quite shocked to find the kind of war plans that they had inherited from the Eisenhower administration. Indeed, Kennedy was given a memorandum in July 1961 from McGeorge Bundy that said, in essence, the current plan calls for shooting off everything we have in one shot, and it is so constructed as to make any more flexible course very difficult.
The history, again, of nuclear weapons has been the ever-elusive effort to give the President of the United States flexibility in a choice about what attack options, what uses of nuclear weapons he could choose in a crisis.
The significance of the relationship between the civilian policy leadership and the military personnel who implemented that policy into the PSYOP is perhaps the most significant story of the period from 1960 to 1990.
Cold War tensions in West Berlin would launch a search for flexible nuclear options by a new administration. A search that would tap many of the strategic theories about nuclear war, which had been percolating at Rand throughout the 1950s.
I think the most serious indictment that I have for this administration is that the relative power of the United States has declined in comparison to the Sino-Soviet bloc.
This administration has not met its responsibilities either at home or abroad.
Our task is to rebuild our strength. I want the people of the world and Mr. Khrushchev to know that a new generation of Americans has taken leadership of this country, and that this free society speaks with power, force, and decision.
In 1960, John Kennedy campaigned on fears of a missile gap with the Soviets, a gap which later turned out to be more symbol than substance.
The Soviets had paltry forces. At one point, they had only 4 ICBMs. That was not enough for a major attack on the United States.
President Eisenhower offered Kennedy or some of his advisors a view of the highly classified information, but Kennedy and his team declined to have any knowledge, official knowledge of this, and when they got in, discovered that the missile gap was in the other direction, that we didn't have a problem in that way.
Kennedy surrounded himself with what the Joint Chiefs would refer to as the whiz kids, and chief among them was his 44-year-old Secretary of Defense, Robert McNamara.
McNamara recruited from Rand people like Charles Hitch, who became the chief budget figure at the Defense Department, Alan Enthoven, who had an Office of Systems Analysis, Kaufmann himself, who had been at Rand. And these were people who applied quantitative methods to solve some of the problems that McNamara wanted solved. And McNamara was a major supporter of these techniques being applied to military problems.
The connection between Rand and the Kennedy administration worked out very well and was very close.
The whiz kids from Rand had new ideas about nuclear strategy and operations, which were unified by the notion that the president should have choices.
When he was briefed initially about the PSYOP, didn't have any choice at all. Kennedy was so furious about this that he said he'd never sit in on any one of these exercises again. And he made it very clear to McNamara that he wanted choices.
One thing that shocked me almost more than anything else about the PSYOP plans that I reviewed in March of 1961 at SAC was we essentially blasted our way through Warsaw Pact countries in order to get to the targets of our PSYOP in the Soviet Union. And I remember, I thought, my God, what are we going to do to Poland?
Moreover, there's no differentiation in those attack plans between attacking nuclear targets, conventional military targets, and urban industrial targets.
McNamara was originally promulgating a no cities strategy. Don't go after the cities, go after the forces. and do it in such a way as to limit the amount of damage. There's no point killing people just to kill them. That's not the point of this.
The no cities approach was an attempt to pursue some thoughts that some of the RAND experts had brought with them.
The only way I could see that one could use nuclear weapons but still have some kind of control over the way in which the exchange might evolve was by avoiding cities.
We asked SAC to develop greater flexibility in their programs, their plans, to provide withholding capabilities. I thought it was very important to provide other options to the president.
As a review of planning guidance for nuclear weapons got underway in the summer of 1961, McNamara was briefing the president about a new crisis in West Berlin. By July, the NSC was considering a variety of military responses to a renewed blockade of West Berlin, including the use of nuclear weapons in Central Europe.
The world is not deceived by the communist attempt to label Berlin as a hotbed of war. There is peace in Berlin today. The source of world trouble and tension is Moscow, not Berlin. And if war begins, it will have begun in Moscow and not Berlin.
One of the most important events was the Soviet attempt to take West Berlin. At the time, of course, West Berlin was isolated from the rest of the NATO, located in East Germany. But about that time, I called the SACEUR, Supreme Allied Commander, who was General Norstad, back to Washington. And I said, look, Larry, they did A, we did B, they did C, we did D. How is this thing going to evolve?
The flexible response doctrine began when Kennedy and his advisors recognized that the Berlin crisis was dangerous and that the utter lack of flexibility in nuclear war plans made it even more dangerous.
By September 1961, a wall separating West and East Berlin reduced the immediate tensions, but it would stand as an enduring symbol of the Cold War for the next 28 years. After the crisis, McNamara issued his first draft presidential memorandum that provided new guidance for PSYOP 63, which for the first time included a secure reserve force.
What PSYOP 63 was a plan to do was to create lower level options pre-planned, not to do this thinking on the spot, not to have civilian officials ad-libbing a nuclear war plan.
PSYOP 63 was a plan that included 5 primary attack options, designed to be executed under varying contingencies of preemption or retaliation. The plan allowed for withholding attacks in a number of different ways and focused on the destruction of Soviet forces while maintaining a secure reserve force capable of devastating the Soviet society. PSYOP 63 was the first effort to control the escalation of a nuclear war.
The military tended to object to notions of, let's say, escalation control, withholds, complications to the war plan.
Many military officers, when asked to engage in more limited nuclear options, have withholds to protect Soviet cities in the hope that the Soviet Union would not attack our cities, felt that this was abstract theorizing by American civilians and that they did not want to have any part of it.
Theories of escalation control would also be complicated by rapidly increasing numbers of Soviet strategic nuclear forces capable of inflicting unacceptable damage upon the United States.
So the attempt to avoid that by a publicly discussed policy of limiting damage to each side was considered impractical, and we moved away from it very, very quickly. And we moved away from it to what became known as flexible response.
McNamara shifted from damage limitation to flexible response. A flexible response is basically saying we have to keep our options open. We need what we need to have for lots of different choices, and let's not lock ourselves into one particular kind of strategy, and let's use the minimum force necessary to achieve our goal.
flexible response, in a sense, was a withholding strategy. We'd only use a portion of our force, hoping that the Soviets would only use a portion of theirs.
Same kind of thing he endorses today, that nuclear weapons should never be used unless the other side uses them first, that we should endorse a no first use policy. The West European allies we had didn't like that at all.
And the Europeans said, well, you're going to fight a conventional war here and destroy Western Europe with non-nuclear munitions, or we are going to be overrun. That does not sound like a very good deterrent. The Europeans preferred to have at least the public discussion emphasizing nuclear weapons.
And NATO policy, in effect, would be supported by increasing the numbers of both strategic nuclear weapons and tactical nuclear weapons.
Today we have a flexible fighting team ready to deal with any threat, whether it be large or small. We are superior to the communists in nuclear power, and we intend to stay that way.
Indeed, there were 7,000 tactical nuclear weapons in Western Europe. McNamara introduced those weapons as a way to reassure the Europeans that he was prepared to use nuclear weapons. I'm not sure that he would ever have used them. That was not his nature, but it was part of a symbol of American support.
Despite my belief, and it was shared by the President Kennedy, that it would be contrary to the interests of the U.S. and NATO to ever initiate the use of nuclear weapons. That was still the publicly stated NATO policy, and it was the policy that underlay NATO's war plans.
Which in some ways is a lot like what was the official policy in the last years of the Eisenhower administration, that we may try to hold you back without using nuclear weapons, but then we may bring nuclear weapons in. It was a policy that was clear as mud, deliberately clear as mud.
In the General Assembly, a vitriolic attack on a Philippine delegate who spoke of Soviet domination of Eastern Europe. Khrushchev falls to personal insult.
I mean, Khrushchev in this way was like Stalin. He wanted to seem stronger rather than weaker. So this was a pretty high-stakes game of politics. But I think to his mind, nuclear war was just out of the question. So it was this, see who would blink first in a crisis.
Since the heady days of Sputnik, Khrushchev had impressed the West with his claims for Soviet technological prowess. But 5 years later, the Soviet leader grew bolder. In October 1962, the United States had Jupiter missiles on NATO bases in Britain, Italy, and Turkey, and their flight times to targets in the Soviet Union were measured in minutes. In Khrushchev's eyes, the U.S. had altered the strategic balance of power.
One of the explanations for Khrushchev's action in Cuba is to plug the gap in strategic forces by deploying systems that can strike the U.S.
On October 14, a recon plane returns with the first hard photographic evidence indicating the presence of Soviet offensive missiles in Cuba. Immediately, increased surveillance is ordered.
The discovery of Soviet missiles in Cuba tested U.S. strategic nuclear policy at a time when it possessed an overwhelming nuclear superiority at a ratio of nearly 17-1. Yet the execution of pre-planned nuclear options contained in PSYOP 63 was only remotely considered within EXCOM, the executive committee established by Kennedy to deal with the crisis.
I agreed we had to get them out because they'd been introduced under the cloak of deceit. But I stated, we should be clear on one thing. They did not change the military balance.
While all agreed that action was necessary, there was no consensus about the impact of the missiles in Cuba upon the strategic balance. The Joint Chiefs believed that Soviet missiles 100 miles offshore were massively destabilizing.
All of the Western Hemisphere, from Hudson Bay to Lima, Peru, is within their range. With the facts now before him, President Kennedy continues to meet with his top advisors.
And I said, what the hell difference does it make whether a missile is launched from 100 miles off the shore or 5,000 miles off the shore. Before they put those there, you knew damn well that if we launched a first strike, they would launch whatever survived of their force, and we've all agreed that it would be sufficient to deter us from launching a first strike. So before they put those missiles there, we didn't have a first strike capable, but we did have a clear capability to deter. Now they put those missiles there in Cuba. We still don't have a first strike. It hasn't changed a bit, but we still have a deterrent.
They realized that they were very close to a nuclear war because as they looked at the potential outcomes in the heart of that crisis, they didn't look very good.
The XCOM never really raised the issue of what do we do with our nuclear forces. The only thing that made them think differently was when I pointed out to them that SAC was moving its forces down within range of the Cuban missiles. And at that point, they began to recognize that this was a military as well as a political issue.
During the 5 or 6 days, we debated two major alternatives. One was a quarantine, and the other was an airstrike, which was recognized would have to be followed by a sea and land invasion.
As Kennedy reviewed the options one last time, he asked General Sweeney, the operational commander, if an airstrike would destroy all the missiles.
He said, "Mr. President, I can guarantee you we will destroy more of those missiles than any other Air Force could. But can I guarantee you there won't be 1, 2, or 5 left? No." Now, at that moment, it was clear in my mind that Kennedy was not going to support the attack. What president would initiate action that almost surely would result in 1, 2, or 5 nuclear warheads detonating on some of his major cities?
To halt this offensive buildup, a strict quarantine on all offensive military equipment under shipment to Cuba is being initiated. Should these offensive military preparations continue, thus increasing the threat to the hemisphere, further action will be justified. I have directed the armed forces to prepare for any eventuality. It shall be the policy of this nation to regard any nuclear missile launched from Cuba against any nation in the Western Hemisphere as an attack by the Soviet Union on the United States, requiring a full retaliatory response on the Soviet Union.
I think that ultimately it was the sheer horror to McNamara of contemplating a serious nuclear war that led him to back off to the notion of assured destruction as sufficient to hold the Soviet Union at bay.
Now, this had an immense impact on my thinking about the use of nuclear weapons. I have often said publicly, the Cuban Missile Crisis was the best managed foreign policy or defense policy crisis of the last 50 years. But in the end, we avoided nuclear war by the narrowest of margins because of luck. All of this influenced my thinking regarding nuclear strategy, nuclear force levels, and particularly my advice to President Johnson.
So later on, McNamara began to stress the ultimate deterrent, the assured destruction capability, as not just the minimum deterrent, but as the essence of deterrence, because he wanted that to be a constraining force.
After absorbing a Soviet first strike, a U.S. capability of destroying 25 to 30% of their population and 50% of their industrial and military capability.
Then the technical people said 400 megaton weapons on Russian cities and industrial capacity would do the job. So that from then on was the design goal for building forces, to have 400 weapons assured of delivery despite their destruction before launch, despite their possible attrition in going through defenses.
At its peak in 1962, with 283,000 personnel and 3,400 aircraft, SAC exercised considerable influence upon decisions about nuclear force requirements. McNamara's initial guidance, supporting a policy of flexible response, had prompted the JSTPS to identify many more military targets.
Flexible response was driving the inventory. If you wanted to have flexible response, you wanted to have a large number of weapons, you wanted to develop new kinds of weapons.
The Air Force immediately not only rejoiced, but saw the opportunity to expand their capabilities, especially the Minuteman ICBM, and they proposed buying 10,000.
McNamara increasingly, during his tenure in the Pentagon, became consumed with trying to put a lid on the nuclear forces.
For McNamara, assured destruction became a rationale for sizing retaliatory forces of the PSYOP, as well as a declaratory policy of deterrence.
McNamara believed that he would be deterred by the threat of massive retaliation, and he assumed that the Russians would feel the same.
But I think that was a grave misunderstanding of how the Soviet leaders thought about nuclear weapons, and especially about the way in which the military thought about nuclear weapons, which was in terms of fighting a war, and, you know, because that was in a way their mission.
They tend to be very tough-minded about these things. They're always interested in much more force than they might ever need. They're very conservative that way. That's their whole history.
And I think that there was a substantial period of time when the Soviet Union built strategic forces for reasons that had to do with internal Soviet politics and internal resource allocations. Nuclear theory and nuclear strategy has made a lot of difference in the way we pointed weapons, but it has not made nearly as much difference as we like to claim in how many weapons we had. And I believe that is almost certainly true for the Soviet Union. Harold Brown once said, "When we build, they build, and when we stop, they build."